Hello, we are now live here. Okay, so, well, good afternoon to those in Brazil and in Europe. Good evening to a few of you, and maybe also good morning to our friends in the US and other parts of America. We are here now live with our second Cosmic Conversation in this year. And we have with us these very esteemed guests, Eva Horn and Jan Zalasiewicz. I'm very, very happy to be here with them. I'll be the mediator for this conversation today. I'm Fernando. As you know, some of you watching right now, I am a researcher in the APPH. And for a few years now, we have been doing research in ecology, philosophy, the arts, with our research group, the research group in the ecology of practices. And since last year, we have been organizing these cosmic conversations to bring together researchers from different areas to talk with our group. And this year, we had this very special opportunity to work with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, HKW, in Berlin, and with the Max-Planck Institute für Wissenschaftsgeschichte, the Max-Planck Institute for the History of Science, also in Berlin. These two institutions are responsible for the Anthropocene curriculum project, and since last year, we've been planning a lot of different things with them. And the first of these collaborations is these cosmic conversation that is happening right now. I would like to remind you that we started it 2 weeks ago, and you can go and watch that conversation with Celia Lowe and Alexander Blanchette, Ecologies of Contamination, a multi-species approach to the pandemic. But right now, today, we have our second conversation, the case for the Anthropocene 20 years later. I myself have organized this conversation as it intersects with my research right now. And our idea today is to talk a little bit what has transpired in these last 20 years since the concept of the Anthropocene has been suggested. What have we learned from it, and maybe what else can we learn from it in the near future as we go through all of these climatic and social changes. Well, I would like for us to start right away so that we can better know our guests, who we're talking to. I would like them to talk to us a little bit about when and how has their research first intersected with the Anthropocene, and how has this relationship developed since this first intersection. Eva or Jan, whoever would like
maybe
to start.
I start because I'm going to be much shorter. First of all, just to introduce myself, I'm a professor of literature at the University of Vienna, and currently I'm in Berlin as the research fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And my claim for fame in the Anthropocene is that I co-wrote an introduction, and so I used this as an advertisement for my books. Hannes, my co-author, and I tried to map the discussion around the Anthropocene from a humanities and social sciences standpoint, which we understood as a complement or as a parallel endeavor to some of the introductions that were already written by scientists on the Anthropocene term, and also some interventions from our field, from the field of the humanities, that were quite polemical with the term. So we thought, we started writing this book, I think, in 2017. And we thought it would be useful to clarify a couple of implications of the term, to go beyond the relatively polemical approach to the term that was typical for the humanities in the years when they started reading the stuff, say 2010 to 16 or something. Of course, there was, before that, there were some people picking up the term. There were other introductions that were really basically going around the way this kind of buzzword can be used in the humanities. But as of between 2010 and 16, 17, we have some very, very important publications dealing with shortcomings of the term or implications of the term that we wanted to clarify or rectify. So that's what this introduction that we wrote is about. It came out in 2000, at the end of 2019. So everything that happened after that, we don't cover anymore. Jan, I think we should, at the end of our talk, speak about where we see things going in the future. But this event is called 20 years later, so I would really like to indulge a little bit in historical lore, especially from you, of course, as the man who probably really popularized the term and did this very important work in the Anthropocene Working Group. So yeah, that much for me.
Okay, thank you, Eva. And the first thing I have to say is that the book is terrific. You know, I read it with great pleasure, learned a lot from it, and it does give a perspective on the Anthropocene that's really useful, and I think it really, as you've said, Eva, helps to map out a kind of direction forward on how to take the understanding and the use of the Anthropocene. So where do I come from? 20 years from when the term came out. Well, I'm a pretty much a straightforward classical old school geologist and paleontologist. So the first part of my career, I worked as a mapping geologist and biostratigrapher. So I looked at old fossils to work out how old rocks were for the British Geological Survey. I spent a lot of time in the hills, with that. And the second part, I became an academic at the University of Leicester, which is where I retired from, at least retired from teaching and administration, a year or two back. 20 years ago, when Paul Crutzen came out and published the term Anthropocene in the year 2000, I have to say I was blissfully unaware of it. And my ignorance of the Anthropocene lasted a whole 2 years until Paul Crutzen published again an article, his equally famous one-page article in Nature. Paul Crutzen first published in the International Geosphere, Biosphere newsletter, which is really only read by that community, which it does have some geologists, but it's mainly by people who look at present trends, whether biologists, chemists, atmospheric scientists as he was, and so on. So the fact that this term burst out and then clearly grew quite quickly for a couple of years was, I had no clue about this, and I think most of my colleagues had no clue about this who worked in geology. Again, and I think that shows, this business of even in related subjects, how separate we can be in that. I'd had if you like, before that, I'd had an interest in one of the questions of the Anthropocene, in that quite by chance, I got to write a popular science article on the far future record of human civilization. That is, 100 million years from now, what will be left in the strata, and that was a bit of fun, and a bit more, I realized, than a bit of fun. because it also involved the tracks of things like climate change. So it wasn't as if I didn't have an interest, but I was simply in the wrong community and didn't have the contacts to do that. And even after reading the 2002 article, except for saying, well, isn't that interesting? I didn't go very much further than that, except by another couple of coincidences a few years later, probably about the year, I guess, 2005, 2006, when it became clear that this word was being used in the literature, by now journals that I was reading, very like general journals like Science and the Transactions of the Royal Society and things like that. And I was then part of a national stratigraphic commission of the Geological Society of London, who were interested in the formalities of geological time terms. So that was, if you like, the concatenation, of a new word coming out, being used as if it was formal, but not being formal, and we knew it wasn't formal. And then the conversation started among us. Could it be? Is it worth following this word up? And rather to my surprise, there was enough interest, amongst again a rather classical. I mean, stratigraphers are, if you like, the most classical of a classical subject, which is geology, probably even more classical than paleontologists, if that can be imagined or believed. So the fact that 21, 22 of us, of I think 22, 21, eventually wrote an article published in 2008 saying, well, this might mean something geologically. We should look at it further. And then came the invitation to form the Anthropocene working group, and the work really started. So we were very late in this. I think the effect we had was in giving some, if you like, it's almost a kind of a realization that this could be real not only in terms of, if you like, contemporary history, but real in terms of Earth history, which is measured in millions and indeed billions of years. And I think that, was part of the, which we didn't mean to do. I mean, it was it was one of a number of discussion papers that we wrote at the time, but it's clearly the one that then developed, and started that. And so really for the past, since 2000, I would guess 9, the Anthropocene working group has been working first to examine, it was a bit crazy, really. We didn't know if there was a subject there to be examined, even after writing that first paper, which was highly general and speculative. So we had to invent a science and see if it worked, and see if it still worked, after people, made rude comments about it and threw half bricks at it, and so on and so on. And really, the work has really been building and going on within that. In a, for geologists, it was again an improvisational and non-standard way. We knew every other working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy is made up of career, lifetime stratigraphers, not just geologists, but stratigraphers. And with the Anthropocene, we knew from the beginning that could not work because of all the things that Eva has written about. So clearly we had to invite the Earth system scientists, Paul Crutzen himself, Will Stephan, but also, archaeologists, historians of science, oceanographers, people who are dealing in, if you like, geographic change, biological change in modern times. And so it was, a very, broad community, and we had to spend a lot of time learning to talk each other's languages, rather imperfectly, but at least enough to get by. And really, that's where we, where we came from. to explore whether the Anthropocene as such could become geologically real and geologically formal, two rather different things. And it was only a few years later that we realized that, yes, it could. I think, Rob, about the year 2014-15, after rather some doubt on my part that it would stand up, it began to gel and began to come together and crystallize, into something that would work geologically. I'm sorry, that's rather a long and rambling introduction, but at least in terms of the history of where we were coming from, that's it. It was a kind of evolution. It's still evolving, of course. It's still moving on to different phases, but it was a journey into uncertainty.
Yeah.
Maybe one question. There was, from what I understand, in the beginning, at least, there was quite a polemical resistance also from your fellow geologists. I would like to know, tell us a bit about that, and how has this evolved since this rather resistant reception towards the term from mainstream geology?
Yes. Oh, that is still there, very, very much. I mean, simply because there is so much different about the Anthropocene. One, it is, as we currently understand it and are trying to define it, it's only 70 years long. That is, one human lifetime. Now, there is the Holocene, of course. The Holocene is just 11,000, 700 years long, so that is terrifically short geology, but somehow geologists have got used to that. But to go a couple of orders of magnitude beyond that in brevity is one thing. And also at that stage, I think it wasn't realized quite how much strata humans have made. There is among geologists, time is important, but rocks are even more important. Rocks are the basis of everything. They are the only doorway into the history of the planet. And so time and history are inferred, abstract, rather mutable events, whereas the rocks are the basis of the science. So stratigraphy, the geological timescale, is based on this thing called chronostratigraphy, which is material solid, you can hit it with a hammer. And so there was, it was not yet then understood. In fact, I think it's still not quite understood quite how much strata we've made and how different and distinct those strata are making. So this has been one of our jobs, to try and show that. And of course, the other thing is all of the things, all of the connections which Fernando and Eva are working on. The fact that the Anthropocene is a geological phenomenon, but it is being driven by complex human action. It's being driven now. It's an ongoing trajectory, which involves all of the humanities, the arts, and also these dangerous things, politics. It has political implications. So there's and geology prior to that, at least has, I think it's thought itself pure from that. It is the planet, it's rocks, it's a history. Yes, it does bring in people towards the end, with archaeology and such, but suddenly to have it, as something which is, has political implications, I think is deeply uncomfortable, for a number of my colleagues who simply have not lived in this kind of world. So yes, I mean, we still have work to do to try and discuss all of these things through, so, on the one hand, yes, we do, it's important that we deal with, our colleagues in the humanities, but it's also important that we deal in our colleagues within stratigraphy. I would say within stratigraphy rather more, within geology as a whole, this sense of almost the Anthropocene being heretical is not quite as strong as among some of my colleagues, who are lifetime career stratigraphers, particularly chrono-stratigraphers. So yes, it's it's ongoing. We have to keep talking.
But in a way, the term or the concept changes the field. Can one say that? It's changing the whole discipline, right?
Yeah, I think it gives it, if you like, another meaning. I can, it must, simply because, as a geologist, again, as a, somebody who's been brought up, as, I could have been quite at home a century ago, amongst the, the Buffon, even longer than that, among the Buffons and the Lyells and all of those people. We are taught to try and understand the history of the Earth. And also there's a very strong practical element, which is to get resources out of the Earth, and that is, how most people earn their living in geology. And of course, a large part of that, has been getting a living out of finding coal, oil, and gas. Is that, as well as all the related things, the minerals and such like. And so now that has been carried out very successfully, as we know, all too successfully. So within the subject, there is a realization, an uncomfortable realization, that somehow the basis of our subject has to accommodate, the fact that there are all these unwanted consequences, of our success, in locating and finding and exploiting coal, oil, gas, metals, minerals, materials of all kinds. And I think that is also, another part of the, the baggage, if you like, of the Anthropocene. We have to live with it, and face up to it, I think.
To go with this first story that Jan told us about the Anthropocene in geology and a little bit in Earth system science and related science, I think it would be great if Eva told us a little bit about the impact in the humanities in these first few years, and then how it developed until now. As we know, in these first years, we had a very strong reaction from the humanities with a lot of different topics that came up and a lot of different ways to talk about it. And then that has evolved together with and sometimes against the developments in geology and Earth system science since then. So I think it would be great if Eva could walk us through it a little bit.
Yeah, that's hard. Maybe a little bit of personal history. I came across the term when I was writing a book on disasters and what I called modern disaster imaginary. And this is how I came across Jan's book, The Earth After Us, which from a geologist standpoint introduces the term, but also uses certain rather literary techniques, such as at the beginning of the book when Jan imagines a spaceship with aliens landing on the planet 1 million years later, which is very much the normal geological situation, right? When you investigate something, it's at least 1 million years old. And so you have this thought experiment. And I was firstly only interested in the sort of post-mankind or after the end of humankind type of imaginary. This is how I came across this. And this, I believe, was very much one of the perspectives that the humanities first took. Oh, the Anthropocene, doesn't that mean that humanity will soon be wiped out and, we're nearing an end and we're a dying species and we brought this end upon us. This is also the the broad brush narrative that I'm giving you now is very much one of the ways in which the Anthropocene concept was understood early on in the humanities. And then as of the 2010s, started a rather violent criticism of the term. A criticism firstly aimed at the name. So if we call it Anthropocene, that's anthropocentric. Yes, maybe it's time to look at humans from an ecological perspective. Of course, the term broke with many tenets of environmentalism. It was soaked up by environmentalists, but then they spit it out or say like, no, this is not about protecting nature. This is not about a balance of biotopes. This is something completely different. And this is something very, very abstract. Then came the criticism, for instance, that it unifies mankind. One of the papers that people reacted to very, very strongly was the 2011 paper authored by a group of people, Will Steffen, Jacques Greenwald, and some others, Mark Williams. And that was a very, very important paper, but it came totally from a natural science perspective. So they literally talk about the species. The species, first they have tools, then they have, atomic plants, and then they have the internet, and then everything is going haywire, or nuclear weapons and so on. And of course, humanities scholars who always differentiate and over-differentiate. They're talking about this culture and that culture and this epoch and that epoch, and it's very, very fine-grained, which is good and sometimes can lead, of course, to over-specialization. But of course, they were right to say, wait a minute, we're talking about mankind as a whole. Industrialization was happening in the 18th, 19th century, mainly in Europe, not even in the New World as much as in Europe. Then we have to talk about colonialism. We have to talk about the way America enters the picture rather in the early 20th century. And we have to talk about all the people who, for one reason or another, are completely uninvolved in that story, in that narrative of industrialization, globalization, and the ensuing destruction of natural habitats, climate change, and so on. So they had a point, but the point was not the point that the natural scientists tried to make. I still think the paper is brilliant, and it was very, very helpful to understand the term. But of course, they were not interested in talking about human beings, but talking about the effects of certain human beings on the planetary system. So I still feel that this debate, both sides had a point, but they were really talking past each other. Then, of course, you have criticism directed at specific economical or historical developments, such as colonialism. There's that for me, very important position by Lewis Maslin and Lewis and Maslin, right? And they point out the role of colonialism, and so they don't talk as much about industrialization, which is very much focused on the 19th century, but they focus on the 17th century. And what did colonialism do to a globalization of European forms of production? a transfer of species, and we're not talking just about plants and like potatoes and stuff that was coming from the New World, but we're talking about slave trade on the one hand, and on the other hand, in the other direction, germs. So they try to point I think it's one of the most important positions to point to the human cost, not just the environmental destruction, but to the human cost of modernization and the how do you say that? The system that is behind it. It's the rise or the emergence of mercantilism that then leads to capitalism. It's the rise of an economy of the most brutal type of exploitation, both of human beings and of environments. And so, that was, I think, a very important position. The term Capitalocene was suggested as an alternative to Anthropocene, meaning, and they're right, historically and economically, meaning that it's not humans in general, it's not the species, but it's a certain type of economy. Now, my personal take on all this is I agree in many respects. Sometimes I just think the criticism does not really hit where it should hit, or it's going past the thing. But what I like so much about the term, that it was so contentious, and it brought up all these different narratives. Paul Crutzen's initial suggestion was, as we know, in the Nature paper, it's industrial revolution. So let's look at the late 18th century, early or 19th century, with the rise of the steam engine and coal as an energy source. Let's look at that as the beginning of the Anthropocene. Today, we have, from the Anthropocene Working Group, a totally different historical perspective. But what I like about the term is that it is or was so contentious, and people came up with alternative narratives, alternative viewpoints, and criticism that enriched the term. So very often when I give a talk on the Anthropocene, there's someone in the audience says, but Anthropocene is just the wrong term. Why don't you call it Capitalocene? And it's like, look, the Capitalocene is an aspect of the Anthropocene. I think the Anthropocene as a concept is best understood as an umbrella term or a synthesis of a way of understanding the present predicament, the present condition of the planet. And it's not about old school environmentalism. It's not about anti-capitalist criticism or criticizing capitalism. But if it's done well, it should absorb all this. It should also absorb the different suggestions that, for good reasons, were made from historians as to the beginning of the Anthropocene. There's archaeology that suggested an early Anthropocene, like placing it more or less coeval with the Holocene, so the Holocene disappears altogether. Not so sure. I don't agree, but already, discussing that between Jan and maybe some of the adopters of the early Anthropocene, all of a sudden you have a brilliant, super interesting discussion. Then there is there are several suggestions for the early Anthropocene. Then there is the so-called Orbis spike, which is the Louis Maslin suggestion. Then there was the industrial age, or the industrial revolution. And then there is the suggestion we have now obviously settled on, which is the Great Acceleration. But each of these narratives focuses historically on a different aspect of civilization and of human history. And that's why it would make sense to rather speak about phases or stages of the Anthropocene. And I think all this whole debate can be absorbed by the concept without just discarding the concept. So I think that is a little bit of an account of what's happened in the past 20 years from a humanities point of view. Yeah,
perfect, Eva. Thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned, well, Lewis and Maslin's proposal, and then Kreutz and Stormer's proposal, and the current Anthropocene Working Group's proposal, because we have, they talk about, they try and talk about more or less the same thing, but in the end they have very different takes, but they also, that has a very important conversation that adds a lot to whatever we might end up working with. But I think this would be the perfect segue for us to talk a little about what is the current proposal that the Anthropocene Working Group is putting forward, right? Because I would also very much like to know how much of a consensus we have right now on it in the Anthropocene Working Group itself. I know that has been a long work, and also in the community in general. In your, I think it's your latest paper as the Anthropocene Working Group, this paper that I would very much recommend, The Anthropocene Comparing Its Meaning in Geology with Conceptual Approaches Arising in Other Disciplines, right, from March this year, I believe. And I would very much recommend to the people watching right now to read it later. But in this paper, they show us a little bit about all this discussion that we're talking about right now, and also the current proposal of the Anthropocene Working Group. So I would very much love to hear Jan and Eva talk a little bit about what the Anthropocene Working Group thinks it's happening right now.
Maybe Jan should start, and then I have
okay.
I have, as always, the Humanities Disagree. I have an alternative suggestion.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, you know, after that, I mean, that was a brilliant, you know, run through of the span, you know, of you know, motive forces, driving forces, you know, phenomena, you know, within, if you like, you know, the human world, you know, both cause and effect within the human world. But here, let's say, with the Anthropocene as understood geologically, which is again where, you know, if I have to stress that this is one prism, one perspective to look at the Anthropocene, and I think we often stress, you know, this is the geological or chronostratigraphic Anthropocene, which is a unit of time and history of the planet. So it is Earth-centered, Earth-focused, and it's trying to look at, if you like, the main diagnostic signals of a planet which is, of course, dynamic. You know, it has to regulate a biosphere, has to regulate climate, you know, ocean conditions, and so forth. And the record of that regulation is held preserved within strata. And strata act as a kind of flypaper for information. You know, they tell extraordinary eloquent stories once you learn to decipher them. So it is a very particular, you know, and we emphasize it is one perspective out of very many. But within that, looking at a planetary history, it was clear, and you know, Paul Crutzen saw and Will Stephan saw straight away that something had started quite recently historically, which was quite different from the long history, you know, including the long human history of the Holocene. And that long human history, you know, had been crowded, eventful, had all manner of wonderful things and awful things, you know, tangled up within it. But by and large, the planet's, if you like, main diagnostic factors and life support system stayed stable. So temperature stayed stable, climate stayed stable. The biosphere was affected, but it more or less functioned, pretty well functioned as before. Sea level stayed exceptionally stable. So all of this. So this was, if you like, a canvas for humans then to, to live and enact their histories on. And so Paul Crutzen's great insight, I think, was to say that what was happening now was taking the Earth out of the envelope, the rather stable envelope of Holocene conditions in that. And this is really what we've been examining. Firstly, in terms of what is happening. So we use evidence like the extraordinary rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the rate of rise of methane, things like species losses, and in terms of understanding new kinds of chemistry, pollution translated, into signals that we can read in strata on that, plastic pollution, obviously, and things like that. So these are all, if you like, it's a kind of diagnosis, of the Earth system, put against a large time scale perspective. So it's the Anthropocene because it is important on the scale of millions, tens of millions, perhaps even billions of years. That was not the case during all of the history, of the Holocene. So let's say Holocene history had continued more or less as it had done, and those trends had continued. We'd have, carbon dioxide below 300 ppm. We'd have, no hint of melting ice caps or rising sea levels. We'd have, had that been the case, and history had just continued, and it's, complete with colonization, conquests, different political systems, we wouldn't be having this conversation here. There would have been no need. And whether one called it the Holocene or the Anthropocene would have been trivial. It was just a name. But clearly something very big started to change with planetary signals. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, and this is where we first started. When we wrote the paper in 2008, that was our, we then more or less, I think, agreed with Paul Crutzen. This is when it started, and part of, if you like, my own personal despair at the first few years of the Anthropocene Workings Group work was that we couldn't really make this work geologically. In that we need to construct a time framework and therefore find a time boundary. The Industrial Revolution didn't work. It was too slow. It was too scattered in time and place around the world. It marvelous dramatic history, and of course symbolically important moments. James Watt and the steam engine and all that kind of thing, but it didn't work. It was only when we took, again, not our idea, but this was John McNeill and again Will Steff and Paul Crutzen, this idea of the great acceleration, this, the Trente Glorieuses in France and all of it, its synonyms, that, the geological, the Earth system signals, this is when the Earth system really began to change on a trajectory which is still, of course, going on. And this is when all kinds of signals began to appear within recent strata, which had significance in terms of the history of the planet. So these were, climate-related signals, pollution-related signals, loss of biodiversity-related signals. All big important things with very long consequences. We are starting something climatically now, and that will take, at least 50 or 100,000 years to run through. The biological changes that have already been taking place will have a permanent effect. It's like an omelette you can't unscramble. There will be a new kind of biology, therefore a new kind of paleontology, and most sharply defined, again, from this mid-20th century. So it is what we were doing was a diagnosis written in a kind of combination of Earth system terms. We're looking at the planet, and also geological terms. We're looking at this as a potential new interval of the geological timescale, which has to pass certain criteria. So we've been quite formalistic about it. Now, we were aware always, and I think geologists are always aware, that behind all of these changes, there are a lot of driving forces, which in this case are mostly human, which are hugely important, complex, need to be sorted out, teased out, need to be understood. We also understood that whatever happened in the mid-20th century had its roots much earlier. Whether it's the beginning of hunting 50,000 years ago when the megafaunal extinctions, or the beginning of farming, or colonization, or all of these things were running through. But in terms of the planet, in terms of the Earth, and if you like, its life support signals, this is the big change. And it is a difference between a horizontal line at first approximation, going along from the Pleistocene into the Holocene, and that begins an upturn, roughly the mid 19th century, and then that upturn becomes vertical, and it is a form of description, and to me, what it does is it invites the historians, the humanists, the anthropologist, to explain to us what is happening. How did this come about? What succession of events caused this, dramatic change from, effectively a horizontal line to effectively a vertical line, with a rather narrow transition in between of a century. Or so. And to me, the two are completely complementary. Again, I think this is part of the criticism has arisen out of an incomplete understanding, of how another discipline, in this case, stratigraphic geology, works. So for instance, when you in defining any other geological boundary, let's say between the Cretaceous, and the Paleogene periods, the famous meteorite strike and the death of the dinosaurs and so on, there is one job to do, which is to define those two time units, so one can speak to them, about them systematically and consistently, and analyze them, and everybody knows what everybody else is talking about. The other question is working out exactly what happened. Why this meteorite? The Earth has been hit by lots of meteorites. Meteorites are not all the same. This one particularly is set in, and was it ocean acidification? Was it the blast? Was it wildfire? Was it and so there's a set of questions there, which are then entrained by the business of having put in place, a boundary, saying this is different from this. And then what's the nature of the history? What's driving what? What are the consequences? So to me, the two, geologists, we know a bit about rocks, but our areas of ignorance about life beyond rocks, are often alarmingly large. And in this case, the humans are the drivers, 90 plus, probably 99% plus, at the moment. So, but we are not equipped to understand the nature of these driving forces, or the length scales of which they pair, the connections between them. So to me, it's, there should be no, and we're not asking even that, the umbrella, the Anthropocene should be used as an umbrella term or anything like that, or has anything other than quite a specific meaning, and specific simply to make it consistent, so when, Fernando, you use a term, and Eva, you use a term, I use a term, we more or less have the same thing, and so we can compare, things between that. And you know, one, I think, side issue here is the name. Geological time names, you know, have no real meaning. I mean, I work on the Silurian 400 million years ago. That is an ancient rock tribe. It has nothing to do, you know, with almost everything that I work on in the Silurian. It's a name, you know, Eva is Eva, Fernando is Fernando, and I'm Jan, and you know, it's nothing more than that. And yet again, you know, as Eva, you've said, you know, so clearly, you know, that the name itself caused a lot of, you know, it was like a big boulder dropped into a pond, you know, and maybe a more bland name wouldn't have mattered. But it really doesn't matter what you call it. The thing is, Paul Crutzen called it that. It went into the literature. It's been used. You know, it's gone on that. So it would make not much sense, I think, to change it from Paul Crutzen's meaning, you know, which was as an epoch of Earth history different from, you know, the Holocene. But again, you know, it's yeah. So, you know, that is, if you like, my point of view. We're making quite a narrow and formal diagnosis. We are interested in, but are not really looking at, if you like, the causes of you know, the illness, if you look at it like that. And certainly, you know, as the Anthropocene Working Group, you know, we're not at all equipped to talk about cures. You know, it's simply saying, this is happening to the Earth. These are the sets of symptoms. You know, it's useful to parcel them up in this way to compare them with a set of symptoms before, because they are quite different. And it makes sense to separate them, you know, and to compare one against the other. But otherwise, then, you know, we hand over. Our rather simple work has then been done. And, you know, Eva and Fernando, your rather more complicated, difficult and important work, you know, which has already begun, therefore takes over, and you work out, you know, how, why, and if anything, what can be done about this predicament.
Yeah, so that now comes my part, which again is complementary. As you said, your use of the term is diagnostic. And in that paper, in Earth Future that Fernando already mentioned, the humanities and social sciences are assigned a certain site in the whole debate, and that's called, I think, the meta level of responsibility. It's essentially in a graph at the end of the paper. And the caption is, in fact, the text of an email I think I sent to you or to Mark or something. But I like this idea. I like this meta level of responsibility. Nevertheless, it sounds like, oh, these guys have the meta level and that's a sideshow and we look, but it's not. It's so not. Because the responsibility means two things. It means, on the one hand, it refers to a historical narrative. Who did this? How did this happen? That's responsibility. Who's responsible? And on the other hand, it means what can be done. Who are the actors that today should be held responsible, and how can we change the situation? So that's where I believe that a historical narrative about how did we come here hangs together, is related to the question what can be done now. As for the historical thing, I would just like to give to make a case for one candidate that has completely fallen out of favor for the beginning of the Anthropocene, and that's the good old Industrial Revolution. Yawn, yawn, yawn. Nobody likes that, but I think it's so obvious. Why is it obvious? There's one major disruption that happens at the end of the 18th, mainly at the beginning of the 19th century and throughout the 19th century, is a switch of energy sources. It's the move from animal force, human force, wood, to a trove of energy that is found below the ground. So all of a sudden, being confined by what has been called an energy regime that is essentially circular and limited and gets you into all sorts of Malthusian traps, right? The limits to growth are the limits of energy, of available energy. And then with the use of coal, everything becomes unchained, right? It's an energy revolution that has, of course, the side of resource depletion or in extractionism. It also leads to a different stage of colonialism, which is really yet different. It makes also colonialism really a completely global phenomenon in the 19th century. Its differences in land use, because land is used much more intensively and extensively. A lot of wild ground is transformed into fields. And of course, it's also a total transformation of society, of the ways people work, the ways people live. All of a sudden, with this injection of unlimited energy that is there, we don't have to wait for summer or cut down the last trees on our island, in our forest. We just dig the ground and we can do whatever we want. This is, I believe, really the moment when modernity takes off. It's also a moment of a renewal of ideas and, the rise of nationalism, change in the way colonialism is being done. I believe it's really the beginning of mobilized worldwide trade in terms of being the beginning of globalization. But it all hinges on this question of energy transition, of going from one energy regime to another. So thinking about this as a prehistory to the Anthropocene, of course, it makes sense because quantitatively everything explodes in the 1950s. Not only world population, but everything. Land use, water use, resource consumption, and it explodes. But the basis is the move from solar energy to fossil energy, and that is why I would say questions of energy use and distribution are at the forefront of any kind of cure, which leads us into the whole disaster of questions of justice, environmental justice, but also economical justice. What poor countries want is more resources and more energy at their disposal. And so saying, oh, now we all want to go back to solar energy. And for some, that's high tech. And for other societies, it's just stop, don't grow, is an immense problem. So it's a question of, economic justice between the many living people currently on the planet, but it's also in an even more philosophical way, it's a question of justice between those that are alive today and those that will live in the future. And what I found so fascinating recently in the past 2 years is really the rise of Fridays for Future. I see that as a children's movement. It's the movement of persons who have no saying whatsoever in the current state of affairs. They have no political voice whatsoever. All they can do is like pester their parents and teachers, but they can't even vote. And we have 30 years of robust knowledge and research on climate change, but it needed a school child to translate that into a political problem. And this is why I think this energy question is really at the core of everything, even though, of course, when one looks at the research by Johan Rockström, for instance, he's very good at explaining it's not just climate change. The Anthropocene is not just climate change, but it's an energy transition, and what is needed now is, of course, an energy transition, again, a new kind of energy transition. So this is how I believe that the questions of responsibility in a historical direction and in a policy direction or future direction are tightly related.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting. Please, Jan.
Okay. No, yes, you're quite right, Fernando. I think that's beautifully put, Eva. And yes, I mean, you make so many good points. And certainly, I remember, you know, in that kind of years between, you know, 2010 and 13, 14, trying for all those reasons, you know, and you know, because of Paul Crutzon's original placement, you know, to make the Anthropocene work geologically, you know, at, you know, beginning of the 19th century, somewhere around there, you know, or in that, but it wouldn't. Again, you know, again, we're a geological chronostratigraphical working group. And on the one hand, yes, of course, we have to, you know, with the Anthropocene, we deal with everybody, but it also, because it is a potential formal chronostratigraphic unit, it has to work, you know, at that level. You know, it has to be a functional geological unit. You know, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you know, and that early 19th century time was just too slow, too fuzzy, too different. There was no, I was hoping for some signal to come through. It could be anything. It could have been, let's say, that the Tambora 1815 volcanic eruption had been big enough to spread an ash layer, you know, across most of the world. That would have done it. That would have been a signal. Doesn't matter that it's not an anthropogenic signal, but it would have been a signal for that unit of time. But we couldn't find anything like that, but we could find lots, you know, of a whole array of signals, which were pretty much global and pinned down, you know, if like that decade, that you know, 1945, 1955 decade, you know, and one, you know, so it's simply, you know, to us, it's a fact of life. You know, it's a messy solution. It would have been nicer and it would have given more strata, you know, we could have included all of that. You're quite right, it is fundamental. But most geological boundaries, you know, are very messy, very difficult, involve all kinds of transitions over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. And one has to make a decision about the least worst place to put a boundary. So this is where we were. And in fact, the least worst turned out pretty good. For my money, it is the, you know, the second sharpest boundary in the geological time record after the Cretaceous Paleogene 1. We can't quite compete with a major asteroid strike in terms of you know, rapid transitions, but it's close. You know, it is in that sense. And you know, at that level, perhaps it doesn't matter whether it's, you know, 1800, 1815, or 1950. But for us now, it does matter. I think both historically and you know, certainly in terms of convincing our geological colleagues that we have a geological unit that works on its own terms. You know, and again, we can't. You know, we can only say, you know, it shows a very clear pattern. It would have been nicer, you know, that's, you know, and I do remember scratching my head over this, you know, for several years, to make that industrial revolution boundary work. But it started in Britain, moved across to Europe, moved across, and so on and so on. And so it was a rolling program. And the carbon dioxide didn't really start lifting off till about 1850. That's when the atmosphere really began to change. So there was more than half a century, when it was negligible in planetary terms, in our terms. So again, this is all part of, if you like, the complexity, of what it is. So we, again, it's part of, it is, you're right, I can't think, had humans not found or not used, the buried hydrocarbon, then history would have been very different, and geology would have been very different, in that, a critical, key moment. But geologically, we, in terms of establishing a unit that one can trace around the world, examine, analyze, study, try and understand, the mid-20th century, came out pretty clearly, as a candidate. Again, this is taking the focus to the Earth. This is when, a whole array of changes happened. The trajectory of Earth history changed markedly. It did change, in the Industrial Revolution, but that change is slight and subtle by comparison, with the mid 20th century.
But that brings about a very interesting point, which is something that geologists don't often have to worry about, which is the prehistory of their markers, and what Eva brings to us in this case, right? We acknowledge the fact that the very good geological signals are in the 20th century, but it seems like for the humanities purpose, we also have to introduce this sort of awkward concept of the prehistory of geological signals, in this case, when we're dealing with anthropogenic change.
If I could leap in here, Fernando, I think that is not the case. We are always dealing with the prehistory of all of our boundaries. I think because, you all, as I said, I use the Cretaceous Paleogene because that is the obvious one to compare with. But most geological boundaries, are a whole set of changes, ratcheting, through the physical world, the chemical world, the biological world, which I say roll, so, let's say over the Precambrian, Cambrian boundary, they unfold over something like 25 million years. And it really is a headache, to work out which one to choose in that. And there was a choice made, some years back, and it may well be changed again because it doesn't work well enough. But one is concerned with all of that and the history going straight back. So yes, we're always concerned. So let's say when I work on Silurian geology, I am very concerned with what happens in the Ordovician period beforehand. And really, it's, I don't make, I don't treat that as a boundary or any kind of, Silurian things are more important than Ordovician. It is a continuum, and we simply establish these not quite arbitrary, but dynastic units, useful time units. So we're able to cope with the complexity of the histories involved in that. So exactly the same, with the Anthropocene, simply because geologically, the Industrial Revolution would occur a little bit before the beginning, the chronostratigraphic beginning of the Anthropocene. Doesn't mean we would discard it or ignore it. Rather the contrary. It is an object of keen interest, as are beginnings of colonialism, beginnings of agriculture. The whatever happened to humans 50,000 years ago, to make them culturally modern, as opposed to the quarter of a million years. Sorry, quarter of a million years. When they were just another hominid species. So all these things are part of the history, and the boundaries are simply so we can make comparisons. It's not a case of rejecting if you're outside the Anthropocene. It's simply the most convenient unit for discussion on that. I'm not a chauvinist about any period. They are all of equal weighting, in Earth history. You couldn't have one without the other.
Yeah, but that brings me to one other of my favorite topics in the Anthropocene debate. Is really the relation between the disciplines. And I think the whole point is to kind of know enough about each other's epistemic, if I may, basis, and also listen carefully, because I'm still in the process of understanding exactly how geochronostratigraphy works and how these units are defined. And historical units in the humanities are defined completely differently. And so very, very often we have kind of events that take place within a week. The beginning of the First World War, the French Revolution, it's like, bam, something blows up. Yeah, you can write a prehistory of the French Revolution that also has, for instance, climatic aspects to it, but the time works completely differently. And that's where I believe we do not always have to come to some kind of agreement, okay, it's the 50s and period, but we need to speak about these different points of view from which we approach the problem. And what is also, it's a German term, Erkenntnisinteresse. What is our interest in our research? What do we want to find out? What do we want to know? And I think that is quite different. That is even different between humanities and social sciences. It's different between several categories of the humanities, and certainly different even in the earth sciences. You have totally different Erkenntnisinteresse, interests of understanding or perspectives of research. And what I witness now is that we all of a sudden, with the wake-up call of that concept and of that diagnosis coming from the sciences, we managed to do that. We managed to speak to each other about the same problem, while we have different definitions, while we have different historical narratives that do not even coincide, like we just saw, but we still agree on a lot of things, and we still can learn a lot also about our differences. And that's why I want to advertise another really, really great book co-authored by Julia Thomas, Mark Williams, and Jan Zalasiewicz, which is the Anthropocene multidisciplinary approach. I think it came out last year, and for me it was really the first work in this perspective that engages in a dialogue. Julia Thomas is a historian of East Asia, and two scientists in a dialogue between the humanities and the sciences. And it's extremely interesting and intriguing how you describe also the differences, how certain categories function for humanities scholars, like agency and actors, and who's the instance driving an event. That makes sense in history. It doesn't make so much sense in geology unless you have a meteorite, and he did not do it on purpose, right? So I think, and that's That's the fun part about this whole research perspective, that we really need to engage in the multidisciplinary dialogue that is way beyond the interdisciplinary things where people just appropriate knowledge or findings from other fields and then put it into their own books. But multidisciplinary also means having totally different approaches to a topic and speaking about the differences without wanting to resolve the whole. It's like, now who's right, you or me? And that is really fantastic. I find this is the momentum that and it's gaining in momentum in multidisciplinary dialogue that makes research so much more fun, you know, and also redistributes the power balance between the different fields. Yeah. And again, Jan is one of the heroes of that too.
Yes, well, you also, Eva, because you are approaching these strange, I mean, you're perfectly right, and you've put it beautifully. We need, to, establish these dialogues, which are difficult. There's no doubt, that the learning curve is steep. There is a reason for having separate disciplines. The Earth or the world, whether we talk about the natural world or natural Earth or the human world, are both terrifically complicated. And the only way to make progress is to specialize. But that, of course, then means that one then loses sight of what is happening elsewhere, or one is in danger. Therefore, to try then to understand, colleagues who've been working, with different subjects along different lines of thought, with different backgrounds, with different frameworks of logic, philosophy, different scope. There's no doubt it's difficult, it can be awkward, it can be uncomfortable. You're right, it does, it is also fun and adventure, on that. But yeah, it's absolutely necessary. Not least, I think the Anthropocene, I think if it, one of its key uses, is it acts as a bridge, and hopefully a bridge to meet rather than throw half bricks at each other, where we can meet, because it's clear, that the Earth is changing, at a rather steep rate, and it's also clear, that the overall result of an immense set of human processes and motivations and actions, is tied up and bound up with this, not just causing it, but is also affected by it. So we have no alternative, except to try and build on these dialogues, again, which, Eva has been so effective at doing, in that. And again, Fernando, you are now encouraging in setting up this conversation on that. But yes, I can't, it must be, I think the other, if you like, the other use of the Anthropocene, as you say, it often gets confused with climate change or something like that. But it has a far broader reach. So it really does try to represent, the Earth system and its component parts, looked at together, if that's possible, as a whole. And of course, now human, societies and activities are one very big part of that. So it does try and present, if that's possible, some kind of bird's eye view of the whole thing, to better allow closer examination of its different parts and putting them in relation to each other. so hopefully it can serve a purpose there.
As we get here to the last stretch of our conversation, I would like for us to direct a little bit of what we're talking about to the future. So, but my first question is in a sense still a bit historical. In Crutzen's early papers, or Crutzen's paper with Eugene Sturmer, or even Will Steffen's very famous paper, The Trajectory of the Anthropocene, with Broadgate, Deutsch, Gaffney, and Ludwig, they use the term Earth-stewardship or planetary stewardship to talk about the role of scientists and engineers in this new age of the Anthropocene. And my first question to you would be, if you feel like this is what the future looks like for Anthropocene scholars in this moment, is this role of sort of leadership and trying to maneuver the discourse towards a certain kind of Earth or planetary stewardship, or if in fact our role as Anthropocene scholars is different from that?
Well, the question is, what do you understand with what does it mean to be the steward of something? Stewardship was very often translated as climate engineering, finding technological solutions, and so on. But it must not be limited to that. In a certain way, we have no alternative to stewardship, unless we really want to resign our level of civilization, which would mean we would have to be many less human being alive. If we want to go back to pre-industrial lifestyles, we need to get rid of 7 billion people. So that is not an alternative. That is not an option, right? Very often, humanities scholars we just need to change our lifestyle. Yeah, but we have to change it so radically, you don't want to know it. So we have no alternative also to finding technological solutions. The great sociologist Bruno Latour, he has written a short text for the so-called Breakthrough Institute, which is very much a technophile institute, being very optimistic about the Anthropocene and so on. And Latour, within this context, has written it's kind of a piece of literary scholarship. He interprets the Frankenstein novel and says, we all think somebody builds an artificial being or a machine or something, and then this thing goes berserk and it's unintended consequences. And Latour says, no, read it carefully. What he does is he leaves the monster alone. He runs away when he sees it, how ugly it is. And then the monster starts roaming the neighborhood, learns how to read and write and speak, and it goes after his maker for various good reasons. So the problem with technology is to not leave it alone and say, oh my God, technology is awful, we cannot solve this on a technological level, but to embrace technology and frame it with policy, with incredibly difficult policy conundrums, such as how do you come up with an international instance of, for instance, governing energy and resource use in a global way, and balancing imbalances out, and dealing with all these justice problems that I addressed. But the whole point is not to let technology just run away and create a new cell phone every other 6 months that people then think they need, and so on and so forth, but to also come up with a policy to not let the monster roam, right? All the problems of planned obsolescence. I mean, all digital technology is one big hose of planned obsolescence. It's like coming out of the hose constantly, and even more and even more. So we need technology, and we need frameworks, social, political, and economical frameworks. And we have tools for that. It's not like we have to invent it from scratch, but we have the law, right? We have legal systems, and we can make laws. We have taxes. We can use the tax system. We have, albeit not to a sufficient extent, instances of global governance, like the UN. We need more of that. And we need, of course, we need also different. We don't just need more taxes, more laws. Yes, I'm all for it, but we need different instances of political negotiation. We need to involve and not just say that they're evil. We need to involve the people or the companies, the instances that create these problems, that create CO2, that use land, that use water to enormous on an enormous scale. We need to also talk to them and find ways to make them, yield to rationality. I mean, we're now finding out. Jan, you just mentioned the way in which geology was instrumental in tapping into the fossil fuel resources. And one other evil thing that they did was to frame energy problems, or the use of fossil energies on a totally individual level. You take your car to go to the supermarket, that is very bad. And they invented the notion of carbon footprint. That's fossil fuel companies that invent the notion of a carbon footprint because they want to individualize the problem. What we need is, like to say, wait a minute, where's the origin of that problem? It's not the individual that has a car, maybe two, but we have states, we have nations, we have legal systems in order to address collective problems collectively. And why don't we use that, right? And I think that's in a certain way, I like this Latourzian narrative of using what we have and not just saying, oh, technology is bad, let's move back to the woods. That is very often a position that I hear from the humanities, like, it's capitalism, stupid. If we could just get rid of capitalism, we're all going to be fine. No, we're not going to be fine. We're too many, right? And the whole system hinges on the inequality of goods. So nobody's going to be served. It was just like broad brush solution. We have to work with what we have, and some solutions are so simple, and I just do not understand. I cannot wrap my mind around it. Why we don't have carbon taxes all over the planet, right? I mean, just monetize the problem and not get rid of capitalism, but use capitalism to become more sustainable. I hate the word, but in that case, it would be the buzzword of the decade, and we need to embrace that.
Jan?
Yeah. I that's again. I think that's true. We can't, go back to the simple life. That's no longer possible. That's been closed off. Yes, with Eva, and Bruno are quite right. We need to live with what, we are where we are. we need to live with what we've got. Technology keeps us alive, in many ways. So clearly we have to understand it. And I think understanding it is another thing, so, my colleague, Peter Haff, who was one of the Anthropocene Working Group members, he has this idea of the technosphere, which means that, the interconnections between people and technology, is now so intricate, so large, so complicated, so global. It in effect forms a sphere with its own dynamics, rather than all living life forms the biosphere, it's the technosphere. So understanding, the connections in the technosphere and how they work may be one useful way of getting at this. And clearly that, does involve both, the technical connections, the technical Earth system connections, and also the economic, the social, the political connections within the thing, to see how it might be made to work in a direction, which is, if you like, more equal, less harmful on that. And also, again, this is not, I am firmly, I'm afraid, and rather ignorantly, a diagnostician, a planetary diagnostician viewed through geology, which is an even stranger thing. But again, in terms of, the use of the Anthropocene, it can be, again, one of our colleagues, the only international lawyer on any stratigraphic commission, Davor Vidas, makes the point, that, all of the laws which govern society, have been designed around evolving human communities, but a stable planetary platform on which humans live, stable in terms of climate, sea level, geography, and all of that. Now that is clearly beginning to change. Therefore, the legal framework will also have to change to accommodate that. And the idea would be then to try and bring within it the kind of things that Eva was saying. So we use carbon more effectively, basically use less of it, get our energy in other ways, and find other ways of organizing societies. So these kinds of spin-offs of the Anthropocene, which perturb us. For instance, the explosion of plastic products, clearly has been driven, by socio-economic political factors, which made the production of vast quantities of one-use only plastic, a huge global phenomenon. Before that, we used to use glass, and we used to buy bottles and then take them back to the shop, and get a little bit of money back for the glass bottles, which were then refilled and brought again. So there are clearly models, back in human history, human economic, political, social history, that can be used. And one can probably go quite a way back, beyond our lifetimes to see how things worked. And again, I think this is part, of the great benefits and advantages and wisdom, not to put a fine word on it, that historians, the anthropologists and so on can give, who have been studying humanity over a vast range of conditions, specific conditions, societal conditions, geographic conditions, climatic conditions, how they adapted, what worked and what didn't. Broadly speaking, in the Holocene, all of that life took place, and the sum total of human activity kept the planetary system stable. In the Anthropocene, it has been, very significantly destabilized, and it's still being destabilized, and we simply have to cope with that. But going back, to try and take, as I say, to direct, the future of our human economic social systems. There's possibly a lot that can be learned from, how humans have changed, adapted, modified, developed, in the past. I don't know, is that, Eva, you know, maybe I'm talking complete nonsense here, something I'm often prone to, but there are, because we get so wrapped up in the, the world that we now have, that we live in, it's easy to forget, that there are, other ways of living, without changing one's mobile phone every 6 months, and that kind of thing.
And in this context, I think Eva's point about what we should understand here is what stewardship means, or what it could mean, or maybe if we're talking about levels of stewardship. But we have a question from the audience here, and then I'll add something to it, which I think tries to work on top of that a little bit more. Andre Mintz here in the chat, he asks, we have the tools for stewardship, but they are being undermined by right-wing neoliberal extremism, law, tax, international governance. Can we really count on that? So that is one question. And something else that I would like to add to it, which is what level of stewardship is, for example, radical geoengineering or mild geoengineering? How does that fit into the equation? Or if we're talking about this collective work towards a soft stewardship, then geoengineering is just out of the table.
So I love that we always have a culprit for climate policy not happening, and it's the right wing such and such. It's all over the place. Yes, we have parties and political movements that still believe climate change is not happening or is a sideshow or something. I don't think we should be even discussing that. For me, it's a kind of purely political problem. In every political situation, you always have people who have the most outrageous ideas. The point is, and that is new, is that they don't listen to science anymore. They come up with alternative science. They think scientists are all paid by you name it. This whole skepticism, climate change skepticism movement that now became a COVID-19 skepticism movement, and what I see there is that the validity of scientific findings is kind of being destroyed or is crumbling. And that is a big problem. The other problem is that within the political debate, how can I put it? Politics are not really the best instruments to find quick and straightforward solutions to problems that are there. So you always have even not so neoliberal socialist parties who would, oh my God, yeah, a carbon tax, not a good idea, la la la. I don't know of any socialist party who wanted a carbon tax. So it's not just the neoliberal right-wing populist movements, but it's a general ignorance of the political system at large, I would say. And that's why I would think we also need innovations within that system, innovations addressing, for instance, generational justice. Why do people only have voting rights? Now they're changing it, they're going to 16, but why not give voting rights to a baby? I mean, voting can be exercised by somebody else, for instance, the parents. But what we have now in the industrialized world is that the elderly, like, Jan and me, we are the demographic majority. And why is that? Is that an expression of justice? No, it's not. So I think we need to change something also about the political systems, but under the main perspectives, how do we solve these very complicated political or justice problems that the Anthropocene diagnosis raises? First of all, we have to understand what's going on. What I like so much in the Rockström diagram that gives us 9 different theaters of environmental deterioration. He added one that says novel entities. Maybe we don't even know everything, and it's very hard to translate into policy, and we really need to work on that. How do we feed scientific knowledge into the political system and into political decision making? How do we feed the perspectives, the outlooks of future generations? How do we into the system? How do we address non-human living beings or even non-human entities like landscapes and rivers and the purity of the air? All that needs to lead to a change of what we understand as the political system, and how do we, who are the participants? You know, I think we need to really enlarge in the circle of who's playing a role in that, or who has a voice in that system. And the last thing, to get back to the question, is to name culprits and say, but it's you and you. We need to look forward and come up with ideas. Right-wing populism is horrible and not a solution, and doesn't want a solution. But yeah, it's also, these are clowns. I'm sorry to say that. They are unpleasant and they cost us time and money and energy. But what the fuck?
Jan?
Well, I'm say completely out of my depth here in this territory. But I mean, Eva mentioned the Rockström diagram, which again is one of these. It shows different parts of the Earth system. Atmosphere, climate, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, and by how much they're being exceeded and what is dangerous. So, that is clearly gives us guidelines of what needs to be done. And of course, the problem is that most of these things we've known for quite a long time. Certainly for decades. The climate consensus of scientists, has been that the rate of greenhouse gas addition to the atmosphere is dangerously fast and will lead to very unpleasant consequences in a very small number of generations. Perhaps only 1 or 2 now to see really striking climate change. But nothing seems to be happening. So that if like the old if you like, Enlightenment view of science that I grew up with, that the scientists would find out, what was going on with the Earth, and then that would be, used, as some sort of guidance, for the people who organize, human, activities and communities, then to, to go in the direction of change that one might think to be generally beneficial, and to avoid dangerous change. And to be fair, that again, there are historical examples of that working. Some of the great city smogs, they used to be a century ago, or even less than a century ago. There was a radical overhaul of industry, to eliminate those. The ozone hole that Paul Crutzen worked on, and the international agreement and consensus, around the Montreal Protocol to do it, So there are political, as well as if you like, scientific and technical, examples that can be used. But for some reason, it has strikingly not happened with a number of other things, of which one is climate change, the other is the rapid degradation of the biosphere, and there are others out there, including plastics and so forth. So there are clearly very large factors which are preventing something that most people would say as being sensible and for the good of us all. And I guess part of that is that, hydrocarbons give a lot of energy very easily, very conveniently, and have made a lot of us very comfortable. I'm comfortable now because of it, and has made quite a lot of people very rich, and many other people avoiding the business who simply, if you like, lived, if you like, what they, a normal lifestyle because of that. That is quite a tough nut to overcome, because I think it does go beyond, as Eva has said, it goes beyond looking at a certain narrow kind of politics to something rather more widely, and it is. So how to tackle that now it is so clear and so imminent, is one of the very big questions. I can see it as a question. I profess, no wisdom at all in how one might approach that on it. There are many, very capable people thinking, and trying to work on that. So one hopes they get somewhere with that.
Well, I would love for us to go on talking for a few hours more, but that is sadly impossible. So I invite Eva and Jan for their last remarks. Anything else they would love to add to our conversation before we end?
I'm very happy with this conversation so far. So I have no concluding remarks.
No. Well, likewise, yes. I mean, I think it's been splendid, to talk with you, Eva, and you, Fernando, on a topic which is, clearly huge, fascinating, important and controversial as well, of course. Just to add spice, to the matter. So I would be more than happy to, carry on these discussions, with you all and with others, whatever. And yes, let's keep trying to understand just what is going on, what we might do about it.
So we at the APPH and I myself would thank you very much again for your accepting and being part of this conversation and our little project here in Brazil. And it's important to remind everyone that we have another conversation happening on Friday called Atlases, Images, Narratives, Gathering as a Way of Thinking with Lily Carr and Annelies de Carli. This conversation will bring together the different ideas of atlases, work by Avi Warburg, and also Anna Tsing very recently in the Pharaoh Atlas, to discuss atlas knowledge in the Anthropocene. So please be there. All the information you can find at apph.com.br/cc. And well, I thank you again, Eva and Jan, and I hope we meet again very soon.
Okay, thank you, Fernando.